Welcome to tonight's journey through time, where we'll explore some of the most fascinating and unexpected aspects of history that you've probably never heard of. Tonight, we're diving into the world of Japanese courtesans, known for their beauty, grace, and, at times, their complex lives behind the closed doors of the Yoshiwara district. But what happens when these women, often regarded as symbols of elegance and allure, face the reality of pregnancy? In this video, we'll uncover the intriguing, sometimes bizarre, and often unexpected ways Japanese courtesans dealt with pregnancy, a subject rarely discussed in mainstream history. From cultural practices to life-altering decisions, you'll hear the stories of women navigating a system that was as much about society's expectations as it was about personal survival. Before we begin, take a moment to relax and settle in. If you're ready to unwind and learn, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe for more fascinating historical stories. Also, leave a comment below. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see how far this journey through history reaches. And, if you were a courtesan in ancient Japan, what would your approach be to dealing with such a difficult situation? Share your thoughts, and let's dive deep into this intriguing chapter of history. The streets of Yoshiwara, the famous district in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, were home to some of the most beautiful and talented women in Japan. This was a world unlike any other, where art, culture, and pleasure intertwined in an intricate dance. The courtesans who lived and worked here were seen as both symbols of beauty and symbols of status for the men who sought their company. But beneath the glamorous facade of their luxurious kimono and delicate makeup, these women lived complex and often harsh lives, navigating a world where their personal desires were often secondary to the demands of their profession. A courtesan's beauty and skill in the art of conversation, music, poetry, and performance were considered the highest forms of entertainment. Yet, their position in society was paradoxical. While courtesans were revered for their talent and allure, they were also trapped by societal expectations and economic realities. They were not just artists but also merchants, and their value was often determined by their rank in the world of the Yoshiwara. The pleasure district, renowned for its vibrant and colorful atmosphere, housed women who were trained from a young age to entertain and captivate. But what happened when they found themselves facing the consequences of a profession that didn't always protect them from the realities of pregnancy? This wasn't just a matter of love or passion. For many courtesans, pregnancy brought with it a shift in their livelihood, and in some cases, it led to devastating consequences. In order to understand how pregnancy intersected with the lives of Japanese courtesans, we first need to explore their role in Edo society. The Yoshiwara district was not just a place of pleasure but a cultural hub, where the boundaries between art and commerce blurred. The courtesans were highly trained individuals, selected for their grace, charm, and ability to provide entertainment beyond the physical. They were artists, and their lives were intricately woven into the fabric of the elite world. The ranking system for courtesans was hierarchical, with the highest-ranking courtesans, known as oiran, enjoying significant social status. They were dressed in the most exquisite clothing, often wearing elaborate kimonos and adorned with intricate hairpieces. The oiran were considered the elite of the Yoshiwara, and their clientele consisted of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Edo society. They were more than just providers of physical pleasure, they were companions, confidants, and, in some cases, the keepers of men's secrets. But even the oiran were subject to the system's brutal demands. They were purchased by brothel owners and sold to the highest bidder, with their freedom severely limited. While they may have enjoyed luxury, their lives were ultimately shaped by the expectations of their profession and the men they entertained. The intersection of pregnancy and life as a courtesan in the Yoshiwara was a delicate and often perilous matter. Edo Japan was a society with strict rules, and the implications of pregnancy were not just personal but professional. For a courtesan, the arrival of pregnancy meant economic hardship, social disgrace, and potentially, the end of her career. Pregnancy among courtesans was a topic surrounded by taboos, and it wasn't uncommon for brothel owners to require precautions to prevent it. Many courtesans were forced into adopting various methods to either avoid pregnancy or terminate it, as a pregnant courtesan was no longer able to serve her clients in the same way. The economic loss of a pregnant courtesan was a significant blow to both the individual and the brothel. Some courtesans, particularly those in the lower ranks, were even encouraged to avoid pregnancy at all costs, for fear of losing their position in the district's pecking order. Throughout the history of Japanese courtesans, various methods were employed to handle the threat of pregnancy. Some of these methods were traditional, while others were shaped by the demand for fertility control within the world of the Yoshiwara. The most famous of these methods was the use of herbal remedies, which women in the district often used to induce miscarriage or to prevent pregnancy. One method involved a bitter herbal concoction, said to have contraceptive properties, though its success was questionable. The women who worked in these districts would also turn to medicinal herbs, believed to promote fertility control and reduce the chances of conception. However, the results were never guaranteed, and the toll it took on women's health and well-being was not often discussed. Another method, which became known through historical records, was the use of acupuncture, a practice that had a significant role in traditional Japanese medicine. Acupuncturists working in the Yoshiwara were often tasked with administering treatments that would ensure the continuity of a courtesan's service without the interruption of pregnancy. These treatments were typically seen as preventative and were used to keep the courtesans in good physical health while maintaining their fertility under control. However, there were also cases where pregnancy was not something that could be easily avoided. Some courtesans, especially those who were influential, opted to keep the child, although this was rare and typically hidden from the public eye. It was generally seen as more practical to either terminate or give birth in secret, to avoid the loss of reputation and the risks of disgrace. As we explore the role of Japanese courtesans in the Edo period, it's important to understand the cultural attitudes that shaped their lives. In a society defined by strict norms, the world of the Yoshiwara district was both a space for artistic expression and a marketplace for intimacy. However, behind the scenes, courtesans faced harsh realities, and one of the most complicated issues they encountered was pregnancy. In Edo, Japan, pregnancy among courtesans was seen as not only a personal misfortune but also an economic liability. For a courtesan, whose livelihood depended on her ability to entertain and satisfy wealthy clients, pregnancy was a disruptive force that jeopardized her career. Women who were pregnant were considered unfit to work in the district and could face the loss of status or income. This stigmatization was not only personal but also reflected societal attitudes toward women and fertility in this period. The double standard between the roles of women in society and the treatment they received in spaces like the Yoshiwara was profound. While the elite male clientele who visited the courtesans enjoyed relative freedom, the women in these positions were held to a much higher standard. Their sexuality, while commodified, was nonetheless something that needed to be tightly controlled. For a courtesan, the act of pregnancy threatened her ability to maintain her status in the marketplace, forcing many to seek methods to avoid pregnancy or abort if necessary. Though much of the attention in historical narratives focuses on the dangers of abortion and miscarriage, less is spoken about the rare cases where a courtesan decided to carry a pregnancy to term. This decision was not only an emotional one but also a financial and social gamble. For those who did choose to keep their child, it was typically a secret kept from both their clients and the brothel owners. These women would often go to great lengths to maintain the illusion of their continued fitness for work in the district, sometimes claiming to be pregnant by a lover or fabricating medical stories to explain their temporary absence. For women in this situation, secrecy became a survival strategy. The hidden pregnancies were often seen as personal failures on their part, not just failures of society. A courtesan who was found out to be pregnant could face the end of her career, disdain, or even banishment from the Yoshiwara. The loss of reputation was devastating, not just for the woman herself, but for the brothel that had invested in her training, clothing, and public image. The idealization of the courtesan's body in Japanese society, where physical beauty and grace were highly commodified, meant that pregnancy was an act that disrupted the image of a perfect woman. A woman with pregnancy marks or a changed body was no longer perceived as a desirable commodity in the eyes of her wealthy clientele. This societal pressure weighed heavily on women who worked in the district, leading them to explore more drastic measures to avoid the perceived downfall that pregnancy could bring. In the world of the Yoshiwara, the fight against pregnancy was not solely one of social reputation and shame. For many courtesans, it was also a matter of survival. With little control over their sexual health and much at stake in maintaining their careers, courtesans often turned to herbal remedies, medicinal plants, and traditional practices to prevent pregnancy or terminate an unwanted pregnancy. Traditional Japanese medicine, which had roots in Chinese medicine, played a crucial role in the daily lives of courtesans. These women used a variety of methods to avoid pregnancy, some of which were passed down through generations of women working in the district. Herbal abortifacients, concoctions made from plants believed to have contraceptive or miscarriage-inducing properties, were widely used. Some courtesans even turned to acupuncture, a practice that some believed could regulate menstrual cycles or induce abortions. Mugwort, ginger, and peony root were just a few examples of plants used to regulate a woman's body in ways that were believed to keep her from becoming pregnant. The secrecy around these practices was a defense against the morality codes of the society they lived in, as many of these remedies were considered taboo by the broader public. Despite the potential health risks, these women had little recourse but to turn to these methods to preserve their livelihoods. The silence surrounding the use of such herbal remedies was part of the larger secrecy that permeated the lives of courtesans in the Yoshiwara. While the herbal remedies provided some relief, the real consequences of pregnancy in the life of a courtesan were felt in more profound ways. For many women, pregnancy was not only a health issue but also a professional crisis. The social and economic fallout of carrying a child was dire. Pregnant courtesans were often removed from the brothel and had to endure a time of shame away from the district. In some cases, they were left without financial support or the luxuries they once enjoyed. For some women, the only option was to leave the profession altogether. Exit strategies for courtesans who were pregnant involved either finding a new patron who would support them financially or moving into a different profession. But leaving the Yoshiwara was not always an easy transition. Women in this position had to find new sources of income and face the reality of a life that wasn't based on entertainment or pleasure. As we move further into the world of the Yoshiwara district, we begin to understand that life for a courtesan was not solely defined by her ability to entertain. It was a life filled with compromise, personal sacrifice, and subtle rebellions against the strict constraints of society. Pregnancy, however, presented a challenge far beyond anything that could be solved with wit or charm. It was a real threat to the livelihood, status, and even the life of a courtesan. While many would view the Yoshiwara district as a world of indulgence, those who lived and worked there had their own battles to fight. The economic structure of the Yoshiwara was built on a hierarchical system, where women were valued based on their beauty, talents, and ability to attract wealthy clients. At the top of this structure were the oiran, the highest-ranking courtesans, followed by the lower-ranking yujo, and then the cheaper courtesans at the bottom. At the core of this system was the brothel, which functioned much like a business. The women were assets, their value largely determined by how much money they could bring in. The oiran, who commanded the highest prices, lived in luxury and enjoyed a degree of freedom, but they too were constrained by a system that placed profit before their personal autonomy. Their worth, much like all women in the Yoshiwara, was intrinsically linked to their ability to perform their duties without interruption. And nothing could interrupt a courtesan's ability to work quite like pregnancy. For a courtesan, pregnancy was seen as a social and economic risk. For the brothel owners, a pregnant courtesan meant a loss of income, as she could no longer entertain clients in the traditional way. Pregnancy, therefore, was not just a personal issue, it was an economic liability that affected both the woman's career and the brothel's bottom line. For many women, the reality of pregnancy meant forced isolation and a temporary fall from grace within the rigid caste system of the Yoshiwara. The societal pressure to remain free from pregnancy was immense. In a world where women were considered the property of their brothel owners, pregnancy was seen as a failure, a bitter reminder that women's bodies were not their own. A courtesan's ability to remain uncompromised by pregnancy was key to her success, and any signs of fertility were seen as obstacles to her future career. For some courtesans, the solution was as simple as abortion, a practice that was common but cloaked in secrecy. The methods of induced abortion ranged from herbal remedies to more dangerous methods, often provided by unlicensed practitioners who used unsafe procedures. These actions were taken in a desperate attempt to preserve the courtesan's ability to maintain her beauty and appeal, the very qualities that defined her status. As pregnancy prevention was a critical concern for courtesans in the Yoshiwara, many turned to traditional medical practices. The practice of herbal medicine was widespread in Japan during the Edo period, and women in the Yoshiwara used a variety of herbs and tonics to prevent conception or induce an abortion. While there were many medicinal plants with abortifacient properties, some of these remedies were dangerous, and their effectiveness was often questionable. One of the most commonly used herbs was mugwort, known for its supposed ability to induce menstruation and act as a contraceptive. This herb, along with others like ginger and peony root, was used in an attempt to control fertility and avoid the consequences of pregnancy. For courtesans, these herbs were not merely remedies, they were tools of survival in an unforgiving world that demanded perfection and control over women's bodies. Another practice that gained popularity was acupuncture. Acupuncturists in the Yoshiwara played a role in fertility control, using needles in strategic points along the body to regulate menstruation and prevent pregnancy. While acupuncture was a well-regarded part of traditional Japanese medicine, its use as a means of fertility control raised concerns about its safety. But in the face of social and economic pressure, many courtesans turned to these practices in hopes of protecting their careers and livelihoods. When a courtesan became pregnant, the brothel owners had to make decisions that would affect not only the woman but also the financial structure of the entire brothel. In many cases, women were either removed from active service or forced to work in less glamorous roles until the pregnancy was resolved, either through abortion, birth, or a forced exile. The outcome was often dictated by the brothel owner's priorities, which were not necessarily aligned with the woman's needs or well-being. For women who carried the pregnancy to term, the outcome was often bleak. Giving birth while still employed in the Yoshiwara was not a viable option, and the child would likely be given away or sold to avoid scandal. In some cases, the mother was forced to leave the district altogether, cast out into a society that would have little use for her without the beauty and status that had previously defined her. The consequences of pregnancy were not just a personal tragedy for the women involved, they were also an economic disaster for the brothel that had invested so much in their training and upkeep. The social stigma surrounding pregnancy in the Yoshiwara was immense. A pregnant courtesan was seen not just as a woman who had failed in her professional duties, but as a fallen woman, one who could no longer uphold the values of purity, beauty, and grace. This stigma was not only personal but also cultural. In a society that placed immense value on aesthetic perfection and self-control, pregnancy was a disruption to the narrative of the courtesan's life. The woman's body was no longer viewed as a perfect vessel for beauty and pleasure. Instead, it was seen as a site of failure. For women who did become pregnant, there were few safe spaces in the world of the Yoshiwara. While some brothels offered temporary respite, most would either force the woman into isolation or remove her from service entirely. For many courtesans, the birth of a child represented the end of their professional career, and the social implications of this could lead to a life of poverty and ostracism. What is perhaps most striking about pregnancy among the courtesans of Edo is the silence and secrecy surrounding the entire issue. Pregnancy was not a subject openly discussed within the brothel or the Yoshiwara district. It was often a hidden matter, kept out of the public eye for fear of damaging the reputation of the courtesan and her establishment. Those who chose to terminate pregnancies or seek help through secretive means did so in the shadows, in a world that demanded their anonymity and conformity. As we venture deeper into the lives of Japanese courtesans in the Yoshiwara district, we find ourselves confronting a reality not often seen in the sparkling glamour of their public personas. Behind the painted faces and ornate kimonos lay complex lives filled with secrets, sacrifices, and struggles. Pregnancy, which seemed like a natural part of life for women in the broader society, was a complex and often hidden chapter for the women who worked in these pleasure houses. For many courtesans, pregnancy was not just a personal issue but a professional crisis. It was a reality that carried significant emotional, social, and financial consequences. The lives of these women were often closely regulated, and their bodies were viewed as property that needed to remain as perfect as possible. Any disruption to this perfection, especially something as natural and unavoidable as pregnancy, posed a direct threat to their status and livelihood. To understand the pressures faced by courtesans in the Yoshiwara, we must first delve into the structure of the brothel system. This system was both a business and a trap, with each courtesan seen as an asset to be managed. In many ways, courtesans were treated like commodities. Their beauty, charm, and sexuality were for sale. The brothel owners, who often had financial control over the women, invested heavily in their upkeep, including clothing, training in the arts, and even their health, though only to ensure that the women remained marketable. These brothel owners had a vested interest in maintaining the beauty and youth of their courtesans, as their worth was directly linked to their ability to attract clients. Pregnancy, which altered a woman's body, was thus a serious economic concern for the owners, as it disrupted the flow of money and diminished the sexual appeal of the woman. As we've seen, pregnancy was not just an issue of personal inconvenience, it had significant financial implications. Courtesans who became pregnant often faced removal from active service, as the owners of these brothels could not afford to have their high-value courtesans unavailable for extended periods. This was a system in which a woman's worth was tied entirely to her ability to entertain. If she could not entertain, she had little value. Given the stark realities of the brothel system, many courtesans resorted to extreme measures to avoid the consequences of pregnancy. Abortion was a common solution, but it was far from safe, and often carried heavy health risks. Though abortion was not formally legalized in Edo, Japan, the practice was widespread and often conducted in secrecy. Courtesans used a variety of methods to end pregnancies, from herbal remedies to acupuncture, and even manual procedures performed by unlicensed practitioners. The practice of herbal abortion was particularly prominent, with many women relying on plants like mugwort or ginger to induce miscarriage. These plants were believed to have strong properties that could regulate the menstrual cycle and help flush out the pregnancy. However, these remedies were not always effective and sometimes caused severe side effects, such as bleeding or infection. In addition to herbal methods, acupuncture was also used to regulate fertility. Acupuncturists in the Yoshiwara would often be hired to perform fertility treatments aimed at preventing pregnancy or inducing miscarriage. Acupuncture was believed to have the power to restore balance to a woman's body, but its role in controlling pregnancy was not always guaranteed. These methods were controversial and risky, but they were seen as necessary measures to ensure a courtesan's continuing ability to serve clients. Though these procedures were common, they were rarely discussed openly. The practice of abortion was something done in silence, hidden from the eyes of the public. Women who underwent such procedures were often expected to endure the physical and emotional toll without assistance or care. In many cases, the secrecy surrounding these procedures reflected the broader stigma surrounding pregnancy and sexuality in the Yoshiwara. The brothel system itself played an important role in regulating the fertility of courtesans. As brothel owners sought to maintain control over their assets, they implemented various measures to ensure that their women did not get pregnant. Some of these methods included forcing courtesans into restrictive physical routines, such as limiting sexual activity, while others provided dietary restrictions to maintain a specific physique. Additionally, many brothels employed midwives who were tasked with ensuring that pregnancies were avoided or terminated when necessary. These midwives often performed checkups to ensure that courtesans were not carrying children, and they assisted with abortion if needed. The role of these midwives was a critical part of the brothel's ability to manage its workforce, as pregnancy was viewed as an obstacle to the economic success of the brothel. The brothel's interest in fertility control was more than just a desire for profit, it was about power. Women were treated as units of production, and their ability to remain available for work was paramount to their value. The idea that a woman's body was not her own but rather the property of the brothel reflects the extreme control that women were subjected to in the pleasure quarters of Edo. Despite the secrecy and silence that surrounded the issue of pregnancy, some courtesans left behind historical accounts of their experiences. These stories provide us with a rare glimpse into the personal lives of these women and the struggles they faced in a world where their personal autonomy was often denied. One such example is the story of Kiku, a young courtesan who worked in the Courtesan brothel in the Yoshiwara district. Kiku had risen quickly through the ranks, becoming one of the most sought-after courtesans in the district. She was known for her charm, beauty, and skill in the arts. However, when Kiku discovered she was pregnant, her world came crashing down. The brothel owners forced her to undergo an abortion, and the procedure was performed in secret. The pain and isolation Kiku felt during this time were profound, but she continued her work, hiding the trauma of the experience from her clients and the public. Another story tells of Harumi, an Oiran who chose to keep her child. Harumi's story was a rare one. She was well regarded in the district, and her clients included high-ranking samurai. When Harumi found herself pregnant, she faced the difficult decision of whether to keep the child or terminate the pregnancy. She chose to keep her child, but the child's birth led to Harumi's retirement from the brothel. She left behind a legacy of beauty and art, but at the cost of her career. Harumi's decision was bold, but it came with significant social and economic repercussions. In Edo, Japan, pregnancy was seen as a mark of shame for courtesans, especially in the pleasure district. Pregnancy disrupted the ideal of the perfect courtesan, a woman who could embody beauty, grace, and intelligence without ever losing her allure. The cultural stigma surrounding pregnancy in the Yoshiwara was tied to the belief that women's sexuality was to be controlled and managed, both for their own sake and for the sake of their clients. The idea that a woman's body was a commodity was ingrained in the culture of the Yoshiwara, and pregnancy represented a disruption to the value of this commodity. Women who became pregnant were often seen as failures in the eyes of their clients and brothel owners. This cultural attitude extended beyond the brothels and reflected the broader societal attitudes toward women's bodies during the Edo period. As we continue our journey through the hidden history of Japan's Edo period, we come to the most profound and often tragic intersection of a courtesan's life, pregnancy. It was the unspoken truth, a natural force that shaped and defined the lives of women in the Yoshiwara district. But for these women, their reputation, their identity, and their social status were not their own. They were bound to the whims of a rigid societal structure that valued beauty over autonomy and personal freedom. Pregnancy, then, was not just a biological event, it was a social disruption that threatened everything. In Edo, Japan, the courtesans of the Yoshiwara were revered for their beauty, poise, and artistic talents. But beneath the ornate robes and elaborate hairstyles, there were real human beings, facing real dilemmas, particularly the dread of pregnancy. The consequences of this inevitable reality were often far-reaching, affecting not only the women who bore children but the entire brothel system they were part of. While pregnancy was a natural and life-affirming process for women in many cultures, for courtesans, it represented the end of their marketability, their social standing, and in many cases, their livelihood. So, what happened to a courtesan when she found herself with child? How did the brothels and society handle the situation? What were the personal choices available to her, and how did they impact her future? In the world of the Yoshiwara, a woman's economic survival depended on her ability to remain young, beautiful, and above all, available. Pregnancy, then, was a threat not only to the woman's body but also to her career and financial stability. For many courtesans, the arrival of a child was synonymous with social failure. From the moment a courtesan entered the Yoshiwara, her life was no longer her own. She was purchased, trained, and managed by brothel owners who saw her as an asset, something to be cultivated, but also something that could be discarded. A pregnant courtesan was seen as a liability. Her worth was not only tied to her beauty but to her availability, and a woman with child could no longer fulfill the sexual desires of wealthy patrons. A pregnant courtesan often faced forced removal from active service. The brothel would either suspend her from her duties or encourage her to leave the district altogether. Pregnancy was seen as a blemish on a woman's otherwise unblemished public image. Even courtesans at the height of their fame, such as the Oiran, could see their careers destroyed by the arrival of a child. For them, the birth of a child marked the beginning of the end of their status and reputation. The brothel owners played a central role in controlling the fertility of their courtesans. These owners had a vested interest in ensuring that their women remained fit for service. As such, they exercised strict control over the bodies of the women in their care. In some cases, brothel owners went to great lengths to ensure that their courtesans did not become pregnant, often employing harsh and dangerous methods to keep them from bearing children. One of the most notorious aspects of this system was the practice of forcing courtesans to undergo abortions or using traditional medicinal methods to prevent pregnancy. Women who became pregnant were often subjected to medical interventions such as herbal remedies, acupuncture, or even manual procedures performed by unlicensed practitioners. These practices were done in secrecy and were often dangerous, causing lasting physical harm to the women involved. Some courtesans took matters into their own hands, seeking out illegal abortionists or attempting to self-induce miscarriages using herbs and other methods. In this context, pregnancy was not only a personal dilemma but a professional crisis, one that could lead to significant economic consequences for the entire brothel. It was not uncommon for women to suffer in silence, enduring the physical and emotional toll of these interventions without support or care. In Edo, Japan, the act of pregnancy was intertwined with deep social stigma. Women who were pregnant outside of marriage were seen as having lost their moral standing. In a society that placed so much value on purity and obedience, a pregnant courtesan was viewed as having failed in her duties to maintain the ideal image of the perfect woman. For a courtesan, pregnancy was a public disgrace, not just a private affair. The Yoshiwara was a world governed by public perception. Courtesans were expected to embody perfection, both physically and intellectually. Pregnancy undermined that image, creating a tension between the courtesan's public image and the reality of her personal experiences. When a woman became pregnant, she could no longer maintain the illusion of perfection that the brothel owners sought to preserve. For many, this meant an abrupt end to their career and a fall from grace within the tightly controlled social system of the Yoshiwara. The silence surrounding the issue of abortion in Edo, Japan is particularly striking. Pregnancy, in the context of courtesans, was often treated as a taboo topic, one that had to be hidden away from the public. While abortion was not widely discussed in the open, it was nonetheless an accepted practice within the brothel system. The methods used to terminate pregnancies were kept secret, and those involved in providing abortion services worked in the shadows, often operating outside the boundaries of the law. The practice of herbal abortion was widespread in the Yoshiwara, and many courtesans relied on traditional remedies passed down through generations of women. Herbs like mugwort, peony root, and ginger were believed to have the ability to induce miscarriage or regulate menstruation, allowing courtesans to maintain their ability to work. These remedies, however, were not always effective, and the risks associated with them were considerable. Many courtesans suffered long-term health consequences, including bleeding, infection, and infertility, as a result of these unsafe practices. To understand the impact of pregnancy on the courtesan's life, we must look at the way art and beauty were intertwined with their reproductive lives. In the world of the Yoshiwara, courtesans were not just objects of desire, they were also artists, performers, and cultural icons. They were expected to embody the highest standards of aesthetic beauty and grace. In many ways, their bodies were products, crafted, honed, and sculpted to meet the desires of their clients. Pregnancy disrupted this image of perfection. For a courtesan, pregnancy meant the end of youthful beauty, the end of their physical allure, and often the end of their professional life. The Yoshiwara's focus on the visual arts, entertainment, and physical allure left no room for the physical changes associated with pregnancy. For many women, the loss of their figure, beauty, and sexual appeal was a devastating consequence of becoming pregnant. Despite the harsh and exploitative system that governed their lives, not all brothel owners were indifferent to the welfare of their courtesans. While many owners saw their courtesans as commodities, some were more empathetic and took the moral responsibility of caring for the women under their control. These more benevolent brothel owners might have offered courtesans the chance to rest or recover from the trauma of abortion or pregnancy. In certain cases, brothel owners would even attempt to assist courtesans who chose to keep their children, although this was rare. These exceptions were, however, the minority. For most courtesans, the consequences of pregnancy were devastating and left them with little recourse other than to endure. The moral responsibility of brothel owners did not extend far enough to provide the kind of support that could prevent women from resorting to dangerous and secretive methods to terminate unwanted pregnancies. As we continue our exploration of pregnancy in the Yoshiwara district, we begin to understand the long-lasting impact it had on the lives of courtesans. These women, who lived in a world where their beauty was valued above all else, faced not only the physical risks of pregnancy but also the social stigma, economic consequences, and personal sacrifices that came with it. In a world where sexuality was commodified, and reputation was a woman's most valuable asset, becoming pregnant often meant falling from grace, a fall from beauty, a fall from power, and ultimately, a fall from professional relevance. The emotional toll of pregnancy on courtesans is one of the most overlooked aspects of their experience. In the world of the Yoshiwara, a courtesan's value was tied to her ability to please her patrons. Her beauty, youth, and sexual appeal were her most powerful assets. Pregnancy, however, changed all of this, and the emotional distress that many courtesans faced upon discovering they were pregnant was often immense. For many women, the experience of pregnancy brought with it the realization that they would be unable to fulfill their professional roles for an extended period. This would have meant the loss of income, the loss of social status, and the loss of their position in the Yoshiwara district. These women, often from humble beginnings, had few avenues for escape. Their identities were so tightly woven into their roles as courtesans that the prospect of leaving the brothel or transitioning to a different life was unthinkable, at least in the short term. The guilt, shame, and fear of disgrace haunted many courtesans who became pregnant. They were isolated in their suffering, knowing that their career, which they had worked so hard to build, could easily be destroyed by something as natural and unavoidable as a child. For a courtesan, pregnancy was not a joyous event, it was a problem to be solved, and it needed to be dealt with immediately to ensure the preservation of their career. The economic consequences of pregnancy were felt not only by the courtesans themselves but by the entire brothel system. The Yoshiwara district was a highly profitable business, with brothel owners investing significant sums of money in the training and maintenance of their courtesans. Pregnancy represented a loss of profit, as it meant the temporary, or permanent, removal of a courtesan from the active roster of available women. For high-ranking courtesans such as the oiran, who commanded the highest prices, pregnancy often meant an end to their career. While some women might be able to return to work after giving birth, the economic reality was that they could not maintain the same allure or status once they had borne a child. Their income potential was reduced, and many courtesans who became pregnant were forced to leave the brothel system either to start new lives or to fall into poverty. The lower-ranking courtesans often had even fewer options. If a courtesan who worked at a cheaper brothel became pregnant, she might be cast aside completely. The lesser-ranked women were seen as replaceable, and their lack of status made it easier for the brothel owners to discard them without remorse. These women were more likely to face exile or be forced to work in other industries or low-paying jobs. For many, pregnancy marked the end of their financial security and forced them to find alternative means of survival in a world where they had few opportunities outside of the Yoshiwara district. In the highly structured and public world of the Yoshiwara, reputation was everything. Courtesans lived under the constant scrutiny of their clients, their brothel owners, and the public eye. Pregnancy was seen as a threat to this reputation, as it revealed that a courtesan's body was not as perfect and controlled as it was made to appear. In a society where a woman's sexuality was commodified, pregnancy represented a disruption to the narrative of perfection that courtesans were expected to uphold. The fact that a woman's body could be changed by reproduction challenged the very foundation of her marketability. For many courtesans, the emotional strain of maintaining their public persona while dealing with the physical realities of pregnancy was immense. They had to pretend that everything was business as usual while secretly undergoing medical procedures to deal with the pregnancy, either by terminating it or by hiding it entirely. Some courtesans were even forced to wear artificial padding or use special clothing to conceal the changes in their bodies. The effort to maintain the illusion of perfection became a daily burden, as women struggled to balance the expectations of their profession with the reality of their physical condition. For those courtesans who were able to navigate the complexities of pregnancy and continue their careers, their stories were often forgotten or buried in the pages of history. The Yoshiwara district was a place where the lives of the women were seen as ephemeral, like the flowers they were often compared to. They blossomed for a time, but their beauty eventually faded, and their stories were lost in the annals of history. However, the legacy of some courtesans still remains in the form of art, literature, and popular culture. The Oiran, for example, were often immortalized in woodblock prints, paintings, and theater performances, which depicted their beauty and grace. Yet, these works rarely captured the struggles and sacrifices that these women faced in their daily lives. The cultural legacy of courtesans, particularly in terms of pregnancy, was hidden and overshadowed by the more romanticized aspects of their lives. For those women who were forced out of the Yoshiwara due to pregnancy or other personal crises, their stories were often forgotten, leaving little record of their suffering or the realities they faced. In many cases, these women were left to live their lives in obscurity, with no lasting legacy except for the scars of their past. The Edo period was a time when the role of women in society was strictly defined. Women were expected to be obedient, modest, and self-sacrificing, and their sexuality was controlled by the demands of society. However, the Yoshiwara district was an exception, a space where women's sexuality was not only acknowledged but commercialized. In this controlled environment, courtesans lived complex lives, where their bodies were simultaneously worshipped and exploited. The birth of a child disrupted this dynamic in profound ways. It reminded the world that these women were, in fact, human, with needs, desires, and biological realities. In a world where courtesans were expected to be perfect representations of beauty and grace, pregnancy shattered that illusion, making the women vulnerable in a way that society was not prepared to acknowledge. As Edo Japan moved into the Meiji period, the role of women began to change. The Yoshiwara district itself started to lose its former prominence, and the brothel system began to evolve as Japan modernized. The sexuality of women, once tightly controlled and commodified, began to enter a new phase, influenced by the forces of modernity, westernization, and social reform. Yet, despite these shifts, the legacies of the courtesans lived on. Their stories, particularly those that dealt with the issues of pregnancy and reproductive control, remain a testament to the complexity of their lives and the challenges they faced in a world that valued them for their bodies but denied them the right to their own bodies. As we reflect upon the lives of the courtesans in the Yoshiwara district, the Edo period comes into sharper focus, a time when the role of women was primarily defined by societal expectations of beauty, grace, and obedience. The courtesans, or yujo, despite their training in the arts of entertainment, lived under an ever-present pressure to maintain a public facade of perfection. But when the natural course of life, pregnancy, interfered, it highlighted the harsh contradictions that these women faced. For the courtesans, pregnancy was not just a biological process, it was a social event fraught with implications. The birth of a child was often seen as a failure in the carefully controlled system that sought to keep their sexuality and beauty under strict control. It was a reminder to all that women's bodies were not simply objects of pleasure, they were also carriers of life, something that could not be controlled or regulated by the pleasure districts of Edo. In this segment, we will examine the cultural ramifications of pregnancy for courtesans. We will look at the social stigma surrounding it, the ethical dilemmas women faced, the medical practices employed to prevent or manage pregnancy, and the economic consequences that often followed the announcement of a pregnancy. We'll also explore how these women's stories, largely untold in the historical records, were often overshadowed by the romanticized image of the courtesan, and how pregnancy revealed the true cost of a life spent in service to the pleasure of others. The Yoshiwara district was a space where beauty, talent, and sexuality were commodified to the extreme. Courtesans were trained from a young age to embody the ideals of elegance and charm. They were often admired as paragons of grace and refinement. Yet beneath this layer of public admiration lay a more uncomfortable reality. Pregnancy, which was an inevitable part of any woman's life, presented a serious dilemma for the courtesan. In Edo society, pregnancy in a courtesan was not merely a private matter, it was a public event with severe social consequences. The social stigma surrounding pregnancy was such that it threatened to disrupt the entire economy of the brothel and ruin the reputation of the woman involved. For a courtesan, whose value was intrinsically tied to her ability to attract clients through her beauty, pregnancy was often viewed as a blemish on her perfect image. The societal pressure to remain unaffected by the natural processes of reproduction was immense. A woman who fell pregnant risked being cast aside by both the brothel owners and the patrons who paid for her time. This stigma was not just rooted in practical considerations, such as increased cost and loss of service, but in the moral framework that surrounded female purity. A courtesan's sexuality, though celebrated, was to be controlled. If a woman's body became a symbol of fertility, it symbolized a failure to maintain that perfect facade of beauty, sexual availability, and elegance. In a capitalist system where beauty was a commodity, pregnancy presented a loss of profit for both the courtesan and the brothel owner. The Yoshiwara district was not just a place of pleasure but a business where the product, the courtesan, was expected to provide a steady stream of income. For the brothel owners, the ability to maintain a full roster of available women was critical to the district's financial success. When a courtesan became pregnant, it disrupted the balance of this economic system. Many courtesans, particularly those at the oiran level, were extremely lucrative for brothel owners. These women, who were seen as the elite of the Yoshiwara, attracted wealthy patrons willing to pay for their time and company. However, once a courtesan became pregnant, she was removed from the active roster, causing a significant financial loss. The brothel owners often faced difficult choices: should they remove the courtesan and find a replacement, or should they invest in her future, which might not be profitable after childbirth? This created a deep tension between the humanity of the courtesans and the economic interests of those who controlled them. For the women, pregnancy meant not just a potential loss of income but the erosion of their personal value as workers in the district. The brothel system did not see the courtesans as individuals but as assets, and when an asset became pregnant, it was often viewed as a problem to be solved rather than a natural life event. The ethical dilemmas faced by courtesans who became pregnant were profound. Abortion was a common response, but it was not without its own set of moral and physical risks. During the Edo period, abortion was practiced but was surrounded by secrecy and shame. Abortion methods included herbal remedies, acupuncture, and manual procedures performed by unlicensed practitioners. These methods were dangerous, often causing severe bleeding, infection, and long-term health issues. Despite these risks, many courtesans felt they had no choice but to terminate the pregnancy in order to preserve their careers. The ethical considerations of such decisions were often overlooked, as the immediate economic necessity and social pressure took precedence. Women were often forced to make choices that affected their health and well-being without much support or understanding. The emotional toll of these decisions was also profound. While the brothel owners and patrons saw pregnancy as an economic inconvenience, the courtesans themselves often faced a deeply personal conflict. Many women underwent abortions in secret, fearing the consequences if their actions were discovered. The stigma surrounding pregnancy and abortion in Edo society meant that these women were forced to carry the weight of their choices alone. The physical consequences of pregnancy and abortion were significant. Many courtesans who underwent abortions using traditional methods experienced long-term health problems. The use of herbal abortifacients was not always successful, and the physical toll on the body could lead to chronic illnesses, infertility, and even death in some cases. Acupuncture, while sometimes successful, carried its own risks. Acupuncturists who specialized in fertility control were often unlicensed, meaning their practices were not regulated. There were no guarantees that the procedures would be effective or safe, and many women were left with scars that affected their ability to conceive in the future. The physical cost of controlling pregnancy in the Yoshiwara was high. Women often faced not only the immediate consequences of the procedure but also the long-term repercussions on their health. The strain of abortions, combined with the constant demands of the brothel, left many women in a state of perpetual physical exhaustion. Their bodies, which were seen as tools of labor, were pushed to their limits, leading to both health complications and psychological trauma. The brothel system of the Yoshiwara reflected broader societal attitudes toward women's bodies that were commodified, controlled, and used for the pleasure and profit of others. In Edo Japan, the bodies of courtesans were not their own, they were tools used to generate profit for brothel owners. Pregnancy threatened the control that society and brothel owners had over women's bodies. At the heart of this issue was the commodification of sexuality. The courtesans of the Yoshiwara were viewed as exquisite objects of desire, whose value was tied directly to their physical appearance and sexual availability. Pregnancy, which was often seen as a sign of failure or a disruption, was viewed as a loss of economic value. This system of commodifying women's bodies led to widespread objectification, which persisted even as the women faced immense personal consequences. Despite the overwhelming pressures of the brothel system, some courtesans sought to exert what limited agency they had over their own bodies. Some courtesans tried to take matters into their own hands by seeking alternative methods to control their fertility. Whether through secret abortions, self-medication, or seeking out more sympathetic brothel owners, these women carved out small spaces of autonomy in a world that sought to strip them of their power. Though these women's choices were constrained by the brothel system and cultural expectations, their experiences reveal the complexity of the feminine experience in the Yoshiwara district. In many ways, these women were victims of a systematic oppression that reduced their bodies to mere commodities, but in their efforts to maintain their livelihoods, they also demonstrated resilience, ingenuity, and strength. As we step further into the world of Edo Japan and explore the lives of the courtesans, it's crucial to consider the profound legacy these women left behind. Their lives were often shaped by forces beyond their control, and their struggles with pregnancy were emblematic of a larger societal framework that often forced them into difficult choices. While we've explored the physical, social, and economic consequences of pregnancy for courtesans, we must now delve into the lasting cultural impact of their stories, as well as the ways in which their experiences have been largely forgotten or silenced throughout history. Edo Japan was a society that idealized the role of women in the pleasure districts, yet the reality of their lives was far less romanticized. Courtesans were, in many ways, symbols of an idealized feminine beauty, grace, and sophistication, yet their stories were shaped by the reality of social control and exploitation. One of the most striking features of their existence was the silencing of their struggles. Historically, pregnancy among courtesans was considered a taboo, an uncomfortable reality that challenged the immaculate perfection that the Yoshiwara district, and by extension, Edo society, demanded from its women. The personal struggles of courtesans were largely ignored, and their individual voices were often suppressed in favor of a more idealized image. The true costs of living in the pleasure districts, the emotional toll, the physical damage from frequent abortions, the mental exhaustion from constant performance, were rarely recorded, as it was a society that valued appearances above all else. The legacy of these women was buried under a facade of beauty and entertainment. We know of the Oiran and their famous clients, but the voices of the women who lived these difficult lives, the women who became pregnant and faced the tremendous burden of public disgrace and economic hardship, are largely absent from historical narratives. Despite the relegation of courtesan stories to the margins of official history, their images and symbols were deeply embedded in Edo culture. Woodblock prints, paintings, and performances often immortalized the courtesan as an icon of beauty and artistry. Oiran and other high-ranking courtesans were depicted as elegant, graceful, and always composed, with no mention of the sacrifices they made in their daily lives, particularly when it came to pregnancy. These visual representations were romanticized portrayals, often portraying the courtesan as a flawless figure whose sole purpose was to entertain and captivate. The reality of their physical struggles, particularly when pregnancy interrupted their professional lives, was lost beneath the layers of painted beauty and elegant posture. The art produced in Edo Japan created a very specific narrative about the courtesans, that they were perfectly beautiful women who existed solely for the pleasure of their clients. Pregnancy, in this context, was seen as an anomaly that disrupted this illusion of perfection, and thus, it was rarely depicted in the art of the time. The humanity of these women, especially their experiences of pregnancy and the emotional toll it took on them, remained hidden behind the veil of idealized imagery. From the perspective of a brothel owner, pregnancy was a moral dilemma intertwined with financial considerations. Many brothel owners were torn between their business interests, the financial profit generated by their courtesans, and their moral responsibility to the women under their care. While some brothel owners cared deeply for their courtesans' well-being and did what they could to protect them, the vast majority saw their workers as assets to be utilized, with little regard for their personal lives or health. When a courtesan became pregnant, the brothel owner faced a difficult decision: should they allow the courtesan to keep the child, thus risking the loss of their investment, or should they force the woman to undergo a termination in order to preserve her marketability? In many cases, brothel owners chose the latter, seeing the economic benefit of having their assets return to work as quickly as possible. Pregnancy, after all, was seen as a disruption to the business flow, not a natural part of life. While some brothel owners took a more compassionate approach, offering courtesans temporary respite or medical assistance, these were exceptions rather than the rule. The majority of brothel owners operated under the logic of economic gain, with little regard for the long-term health or well-being of the women in their charge. Despite the overwhelming pressure to abort or hide their pregnancies, there were some courtesans who chose to defy the system and keep their children. These women, though rare, represent a form of resistance against the system of exploitation and objectification that defined their lives. Choosing to carry a pregnancy to term was not a decision made lightly. It often meant leaving the brothel, losing status, and enduring public scorn. Yet, for some women, the birth of a child was a symbol of defiance, an act of claiming ownership over their own bodies. The stories of these women are far less common in the historical record, but they reveal the complexity of the courtesans' lives and the agency that some were able to exert in the face of overwhelming control. For example, the story of Harumi, a courtesan who chose to keep her child, has been passed down through oral tradition and is one of the few stories where a courtesan's resilience and maternal love are celebrated. Despite the risks and sacrifices, she gave birth to her child in secret and left the brothel system, never to return. Harumi's story was not one of easy victory, but it represents a small glimmer of personal autonomy in a world where women's choices were often marginalized. For a courtesan, the decision to keep a child carried profound consequences. Pregnancy meant an end to her career in the brothel, and raising a child meant giving up the luxuries and privileges that came with being a high-ranking courtesan. But there was more than just financial loss. There was also the social ostracism that followed a courtesan who chose motherhood over her professional duties. She would be seen as a failure in the eyes of the brothel owners, her patrons, and society at large. Yet, for some, the cost of remaining in the brothel system was too high. Motherhood, for them, became a form of liberation from the constraints of their professional lives. While their future was uncertain, these women chose to defy the expectations imposed upon them by the patriarchal system that sought to control their bodies. As the years passed, the world of the Yoshiwara district faded into history. The brothels were eventually dismantled, and the brothel system gave way to new forms of economic and sexual expression. But the legacy of the courtesans and their struggles with pregnancy remained, albeit often overlooked. Pregnancy was a symbol of both their power and their vulnerability. It marked a profound chapter in the life cycle of the courtesan. Today, the lives of courtesans in Edo, Japan are often romanticized and misunderstood. Their reproductive struggles, hidden in the shadows, remain a forgotten aspect of their lives, left untold in favor of more glamorous stories. But by examining their stories with nuance and depth, we can begin to reclaim their voices and understand the complexities of their lives. Pregnancy, for these women, was not just an obstacle, it was a defining aspect of their humanity, one that should be honored and remembered as part of their legacy. As the Edo period began to wind down, societal shifts began to have a profound impact on the Yoshiwara district. Once the epitome of luxury and pleasure, the brothels of Edo would eventually face forces beyond their control. With the arrival of Western influences, Meiji-era reforms, and the rise of modernization, the brothel system would find itself out of sync with a rapidly changing society. The world of the courtesans, once a thriving and central part of Edo culture, began to lose its prominence. This segment explores how the Yoshiwara district eventually became a symbol of the past, a fading chapter in the history of Japan. We will look at how social reforms and cultural shifts led to the decline of the brothel system, the changing role of women, and the lasting impact that courtesans left behind in Japanese history. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 marked a watershed moment in Japanese history. With Japan's opening to the West and the move towards industrialization, the traditional social structures that had defined Edo Japan began to crumble. The government, in its effort to modernize and create a new image of Japan, began to target institutions that were seen as anachronistic, one of the most significant being the brothel system. The Yoshiwara district, which had flourished as a center for sexual commerce, now became the target of growing reformist movements. These groups argued that the brothels represented an outdated and morally corrupt aspect of Japanese society. As Japan began to shift its focus toward industrialization and global integration, there was an increasing pressure to shed practices that were perceived as backward and unmodern. The Meiji government enacted a series of legal reforms that restricted the power and reach of the brothel system. The government sought to regulate prostitution through laws that would eventually lead to the dismantling of the Yoshiwara and other pleasure districts across Japan. This marked the end of an era in which women's bodies were commodified and used for the pleasure of the powerful elite. As the Meiji government pushed forward with modernization, the changing social landscape of Japan began to redefine the role of women. The rise of westernization meant the infusion of new values, including more egalitarian ideas about gender and sexual morality. The Yoshiwara, as a symbol of exploitation and social inequality, began to fall out of favor as Japan embraced these new ideals. The once prominent courtesans, symbols of beauty, grace, and sexual allure, were now seen as relics of a past society that had little place in a modernized Japan. As sexual commerce began to be seen as an outdated institution, the brothel owners who had once profited from the courtesans' beauty and skills now found themselves struggling to survive in a world that was rapidly changing. With national policy shifting towards moral reforms and social purity, the district was gradually dismantled, and courtesans found themselves pushed to the margins of society. As the Yoshiwara and other brothels were being phased out, the demand for courtesans began to decline. The rise of new entertainment options, such as theater, cinema, and novel forms of leisure, shifted people's attention away from the brothels. The modernization of Japan also meant that women were becoming more visible in public life, with the Meiji reforms encouraging them to take on roles outside the world of sexual entertainment. Women who had once been trained to entertain the elite were now expected to conform to new ideals of domesticity and family life. The transition from public women to private women was difficult for many, and the courtesans, who had once been revered for their beauty and wit, found themselves sidelined in a rapidly changing world. With the advent of the Meiji era, there was a strong push for the development of a new woman, a woman who was educated, independent, and morally upright. This idealized woman was part of the new middle class and took on roles that were far removed from the world of prostitution and the brothel system. As part of the government's modernization plan, education for women was promoted, and the role of women in society began to shift dramatically. Women were now being encouraged to work as teachers, nurses, and entrepreneurs, and their sexuality was no longer seen as a commodity. This transformation represented a profound cultural shift, one that rejected the commodification of women's bodies in favor of a more progressive and individualistic approach to women's roles in society. The courtesans of the Yoshiwara district, however, were left behind in this new vision of feminine respectability. Their stories were increasingly forgotten as Japan embraced Western ideals of morality and gender roles. The history of the Yoshiwara courtesans became obscured by the emerging narrative of the modern, respectable woman, who was seen as the symbol of progress. Despite the societal push for reform, the legacy of the courtesans remained embedded in Japan's cultural memory. Their art, beauty, and grace became symbols of an earlier, more romanticized era, even as their lives were erased from the official narrative. The artwork produced in the Edo period, particularly ukiyo-e woodblock prints, immortalized these women in a way that no one at the time could have predicted. Today, these images are still seen as some of the most iconic representations of Edo culture, yet they fail to capture the realities and hardships of the courtesans who posed for them. As Japanese society evolved and adapted to westernization, the courtesans' lives were left to fade into history. Their contribution to Japan's cultural fabric was often overlooked, despite the indelible mark they left on art, literature, and theater. The Yoshiwara may have been dismantled, but the memory of the courtesans continued to shape Japanese pop culture, where their iconic image remains alive through films, novels, and modern art. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in the untold stories of the courtesans of the Yoshiwara and the Yoshiwara district itself. Scholars, artists, and filmmakers have begun to reclaim their histories, digging into the hidden aspects of their lives and exposing the truths behind the romanticized portraits. The reclamation of these stories is part of a larger effort to redefine the role of women in Japanese history and to bring to light the social struggles and sacrifices that women in the pleasure districts were forced to endure. Through the work of historians and the efforts of cultural advocates, the lives of these forgotten women are being brought back to life. Their stories are now being told not only as tragedies but as powerful accounts of resilience, strength, and agency. These women, who lived in a world where their bodies were commodified, now have a chance to be seen as more than just symbols of beauty and grace. They are being remembered as complex individuals with choices, struggles, and dreams of their own. The courtesans of the Yoshiwara district were once part of a rich and vibrant cultural landscape, but their stories have long been hidden beneath the surface of Edo society. As Japan entered the Meiji era and moved into the modern age, the Yoshiwara faded away, replaced by a new, industrialized society. Yet, the legacy of the courtesans remains etched in the art and culture of Japan. Today, the Yoshiwara is no longer a thriving pleasure district, but the stories of the courtesans continue to be part of Japan's cultural memory. The women who lived and worked there may have faced unimaginable hardships, but their legacy lives on through the art, literature, and history that continues to celebrate and remember them. The Yoshiwara courtesans, often silenced, erased, and forgotten, are now beginning to reclaim their place in the narrative of Japanese history. In the shadows of Japan's Edo period, amid the vibrancy and elegance of the Yoshiwara district, a group of women lived lives filled with paradoxes, revered for their beauty and grace, yet exploited by the very society that admired them. The courtesans of the Yoshiwara were not mere entertainers, they were cultural symbols, bearing the weight of societal expectations while navigating the realities of their circumstances. At the center of these struggles was pregnancy, a natural event that became a symbol of disruption, forcing these women to confront the intersection of personal agency, social control, and economic survival. Throughout history, the voices of the Yoshiwara courtesans have been largely silenced. Their stories, especially those dealing with pregnancy, have been obscured by the romanticized image of the oiran and their portrayal as symbols of beauty and artistic achievement. However, when we look beyond the floral prints and theater performances, we find the real voices, those of women who were caught in a system that demanded their sexuality be commodified for the pleasure of others. The hidden voice of the courtesan is the voice of resilience, the voice of a woman who, despite facing insurmountable odds, still sought to retain her dignity, personal agency, and humanity in a society that reduced her to a mere object of desire. In this segment, we will unearth the forgotten stories of the courtesans who navigated the challenges of pregnancy, the ethical dilemmas they faced, and the lasting impact they left on the cultural and social landscape of Japan. Through these personal stories, we will explore how these women, though largely forgotten, played a significant role in shaping Japanese society. To understand the complexity of pregnancy for courtesans, we must first consider their role in Edo society. The pleasure districts were not just places of entertainment, they were economic systems where women's bodies were commodified and sold for pleasure. The women who worked there, particularly the oiran, were seen as the highest form of beauty, blending sexual appeal with artistic talent. But beneath the facade of luxury and prestige lay a darker reality. Courtesans were owned, often from a young age, by brothel owners who controlled their lives, bodies, and even their futures. The Yoshiwara district was a world where women's sexuality was both celebrated and restricted, and pregnancy represented a challenge to this very control. Pregnancy among the courtesans was not simply a personal matter but a professional crisis. In a world where a courtesan's value was tied to her ability to attract and please men, the physical changes brought on by pregnancy were seen as an impediment to her marketability. For many courtesans, the discovery of pregnancy was a moment of fear and desperation, as they knew that their ability to earn would be diminished, and their status would be compromised. In the economic system of the Yoshiwara, the value of a courtesan was tied to her ability to attract wealthy patrons. A pregnant courtesan represented a loss of value, a financial burden not only for the courtesan herself but also for the brothel owners who depended on her sexual appeal to make money. The Yoshiwara district was built on a hierarchical system, where the oiran at the top could command the highest prices, while the lower-ranking courtesans worked for lesser amounts. When a courtesan became pregnant, the brothel faced a dilemma: preserve the courtesan's career and risk the loss of income, or remove her from the district, often forcing her into exile or an alternative occupation. The economic consequences of pregnancy were profound, and the brothel owners often chose the economic stability of their businesses over the well-being of their workers. The brothel owners held tremendous power over the courtesans. While some brothel owners may have shown compassion or offered a temporary respite for pregnant courtesans, the reality was that most women who became pregnant faced harsh decisions. Brothel owners, whose primary concern was profit, viewed a pregnant courtesan as a liability. In many cases, these women were removed from the brothel system altogether. The brothel owners used various methods to control the reproductive lives of the courtesans. Some courtesans were required to take contraceptives, or were forced to undergo abortions, often performed in secret and with little medical oversight. The moral responsibility of the brothel owners was often overshadowed by the economic imperative to maintain their status and profitability. In many cases, courtesans who became pregnant were sent away to live in seclusion, where they were forced to leave the district and often had to find other means of survival. The emotional toll of this isolation was immense, as many courtesans found themselves abandoned by the very system that had once revered them. The practice of abortion among the courtesans was common but hidden. Abortion, often performed in secret, was the only viable option for many courtesans who faced the economic and social consequences of pregnancy. The methods used to terminate pregnancies ranged from herbal remedies to manual procedures conducted by unlicensed practitioners. Though some methods were considered effective, they were also dangerous, often resulting in long-term health complications for the women who underwent them. Herbal abortifacients such as mugwort and peony root were commonly used to induce abortion or regulate menstruation. While these methods were often practiced in secret, they carried significant health risks, including severe bleeding and infection. In addition to these herbal remedies, acupuncture was also employed as a way to regulate fertility and prevent unwanted pregnancies. The practice of fertility control was widespread in the Yoshiwara, but its safety was questionable at best. The women who sought these abortions were often left to suffer in silence, as the stigma surrounding both pregnancy and abortion was deeply ingrained in Edo society. The brothel owners and patrons saw these procedures as necessary to maintain the profitability of their businesses, but for the courtesans, the emotional toll of these secretive decisions was often devastating. While many courtesans were forced into abortions to protect their careers, there were some who chose to keep their children. Though rare, these women exhibited a form of resilience that defied the system. These courtesans, despite the personal and professional risks, chose to embrace motherhood, rejecting the pressure to conform to the expectations placed upon them by their brothel owners and society. For these women, the decision to keep their child was not taken lightly. It meant leaving the brothel, losing their status, and becoming social outcasts. But for some, the choice to become a mother was an act of personal empowerment, a way to reclaim their bodies and their lives in a system that had long controlled them. Though their stories are less common, they offer us a glimpse into the agency of these women, who, despite the overwhelming social pressures they faced, still found a way to assert their autonomy in a world that sought to deny them control over their own bodies. The legacy of the courtesans, their beauty, grace, and artistic talents, lives on in the art and literature of Edo Japan. The ukiyo-e woodblock prints that depicted these women are now some of the most celebrated and well-known images from the era. The oiran, in particular, became iconic figures, immortalized in art as symbols of both sexual allure and feminine beauty. However, these images rarely capture the struggles that these women endured. They romanticize the luxurious lives of courtesans while ignoring the hardships, emotional toll, and personal sacrifices they made. Yet, despite the idealized portrayals, the legacy of the courtesans continues to resonate in modern Japan, where their stories are slowly being rediscovered and reclaimed by scholars and artists. Let's continue expanding the exploration of the lives of courtesans in Edo Japan, focusing on their legacy, social implications, and the broader cultural impact of their experiences, particularly in the context of pregnancy and its challenges. As we continue to explore the lives of the courtesans of Edo Japan, we begin to witness how their stories are slowly being reclaimed in modern Japan. Once relegated to the shadows of history, these women are now the subject of a growing number of historical investigations, artistic representations, and literary explorations. The process of rediscovery is not just about recounting the romanticized versions of their lives but about understanding their complexity, their sufferings, and their agency in a world that viewed them as little more than tools for entertainment. In the modern era, there is a renewed interest in the lives of courtesans, particularly in the context of gender studies, social history, and art history. Researchers and artists alike have begun to reframe the image of the courtesan, not as a mere object of beauty but as a symbol of survival and resilience. This reclamation of their stories acknowledges the exploitation they faced but also the agency they exercised within the limitations of their society. Many of these courtesans had their voices silenced by history, their lives confined to the margins of societal respectability. Yet today, their struggles with pregnancy, reproductive rights, and gendered oppression are being brought into the light, offering us a nuanced understanding of their lived experiences. Through scholarship, modern art, and literature, the legacy of these women is being told in new ways, ways that reclaim their humanity. Returning to the core issue of pregnancy in the Yoshiwara, we can see that the brothel system itself was a reflection of a deeply patriarchal society that controlled every aspect of a woman's life. Pregnancy was a disruption to the established order, not just for the courtesans, but for the system that relied on their sexual availability and beauty. In a world where a woman's value was directly linked to her ability to please her patrons, pregnancy was seen as a failure, a bodily imperfection that invalidated her worth. The brothel owners were not concerned with the physical well-being of their courtesans, their priority was maintaining a steady flow of income. When a courtesan became pregnant, the immediate response was to safeguard the economic interests of the brothel, often at the expense of the woman's health and personal choice. The economic implications of pregnancy for the brothel owners were stark. A courtesan in her prime could attract the wealthiest patrons, providing substantial profits for the brothel. But a pregnant courtesan represented a loss of revenue, as she could no longer serve clients in the way that was expected. This economic loss often led to forced abortions, with women routinely subjected to dangerous procedures to remove pregnancies that were viewed as obstacles. The physical cost of pregnancy for a courtesan was immense. Beyond the emotional toll of carrying a child while trying to maintain her role as a sex worker, the physical demands placed on her body were both exhausting and detrimental. In a society where the ideal woman was one who was perpetually youthful, slender, and uncompromised by the burdens of motherhood, pregnancy was a source of stigma and shame. In addition to the physical strain, many courtesans endured the psychological trauma associated with being forced into secretive abortions, some of which were performed without any regard for the women's safety. The pressure to maintain an idealized version of beauty often led to physical harm and long-term health consequences. Unlicensed practitioners performed many of the procedures, and the lack of medical oversight meant that complications were common. Many women were left with chronic pain, infertility, or even fatal infections. Moreover, the psychological strain of living in a world that demanded perfection, while secretly undergoing abortions and medical procedures, often led to deep mental health issues. Guilt, fear, and shame haunted many of these women, as they were forced to navigate a system that valued their beauty over their well-being. As Japan moved into the Meiji era, the cultural landscape began to change dramatically. The westernization of Japan brought about significant reforms in nearly every area of life, including the treatment of women and the regulation of sexual commerce. The once thriving Yoshiwara district, the heart of the country's pleasure trade, became outdated and increasingly discredited. The rise of industrialization and the growing influence of Western values led to a rejection of many traditional practices, particularly those seen as immoral or backward. As part of Japan's efforts to modernize and embrace globalism, the pleasure districts were gradually dismantled, and prostitution became increasingly regulated or criminalized. During this period, many courtesans found themselves without a place in the rapidly changing social structure. Women who had built their lives around the brothel system were now cast aside. The fading of the Yoshiwara mirrored the rise of the new woman, a figure who was educated, respectable, and free from the shame that once clung to the courtesans. The shifting attitudes toward women's roles in Meiji Japan were pivotal in shaping the future of women's rights and opportunities. The Meiji government, in its efforts to modernize, began to promote a new vision of the Japanese woman, one that was morally upright, educated, and self-sufficient. Women were no longer to be viewed as sexual objects but as contributors to the national project of building a strong, modern state. For the courtesans, this transformation meant exclusion from the new social order. Once regarded as symbols of Japan's elegance, they were now relegated to the margins of society. Many former courtesans faced an uncertain future, without the skills or education to adapt to the new roles available to women. While some courtesans were able to reinvent themselves, often by transitioning into artistic careers or by becoming matriarchs of their own families, others were left to fend for themselves, forgotten by a society that had once revered their beauty and artistry. Despite the social shifts that brought an end to the brothel system, the legacy of the courtesans never truly disappeared. Their image, though once idealized in the art and literature of the Edo period, has since been reinterpreted in modern times. The visual and literary representations of the courtesan have undergone a re-examination, and their stories are being told with more nuance and respect for their personal struggles. In contemporary literature, films, and art, the courtesan is no longer simply a symbol of beauty but a complex character who navigates the pressures and limitations of her time. These reinterpretations provide us with a more compassionate understanding of the courtesans' lives, acknowledging the exploitation they faced while also celebrating their resilience, agency, and humanity. Through this modern reimagining, the courtesan's legacy is being reclaimed as part of a larger conversation about women's rights, sexual autonomy, and the control of women's bodies, issues that continue to resonate today. As we draw this segment to a close, we are reminded of the complex lives of the courtesans who once inhabited the Yoshiwara district. Their struggles with pregnancy, their resilience, personal sacrifices, and the moral and economic dilemmas they faced, continue to have a lasting impact on how we understand the role of women in society. The legacy of these women lives on in the art, literature, and cultural memory of Japan. While their voices were often silenced by the very system that exploited them, modern interpretations of their lives are giving them back their agency. Today, the stories of the Yoshiwara courtesans are no longer just about beauty and pleasure, they are about resilience, personal empowerment, and the struggle for autonomy. As we reflect on the profound and complex lives of the Yoshiwara courtesans, we find ourselves facing a paradox. They were once revered and sought after for their beauty, charm, and sexual allure, yet their stories have been largely ignored, silenced, or romanticized by the larger historical narrative. In the decline of the Yoshiwara district during the Meiji era, and the subsequent loss of brothel culture, the courtesans' lives, once central to Japan's cultural and social fabric, faded into the background. Yet, as we now examine the lasting impact of their existence, we can trace how the stories of these women, particularly their experiences with pregnancy, economic struggles, and personal agency, continue to shape the modern understanding of gender, autonomy, and sexuality. In this segment, we will explore the enduring legacy of these women, their cultural reinterpretation in the modern age, and how the stories of the courtesans of Edo Japan have begun to reclaim their place in contemporary cultural memory. The Edo period courtesans, particularly the oiran, were once seen as the epitome of feminine grace, beauty, and refinement. Artists and writers from the period often immortalized these women in ukiyo-e woodblock prints, paintings, and literature, crafting an image of the courtesan as an exquisite figure, one whose intellectual and artistic accomplishments were just as valuable as her sexuality. The romanticized depiction of courtesans has persisted through the years, often overshadowing the realities of their lives. In modern culture, the courtesan's beauty continues to serve as a symbol of Japanese cultural identity, as her image is still celebrated in pop culture, fashion, and art. However, this idealized portrayal can sometimes obscure the struggles that courtesans faced, particularly in the context of pregnancy and its impact on their careers and personal lives. While their grace and charm were celebrated, their humanity, including their dilemmas around sexuality and fertility, was often left untold. Yet, modern reinterpretations of their stories are beginning to push past the romantic image, providing a fuller picture of their lived experiences. The feminist movement in Japan, as well as global conversations about gender equality and sexual autonomy, has played a pivotal role in reclaiming the courtesan's stories. Scholars, artists, and activists have sought to uncover the truths behind the idealized images of courtesans, examining their lives through the lens of personal agency, gender oppression, and sexual autonomy. This reclaiming of the courtesan's narrative has brought a new perspective to their lives, one that acknowledges both their exploitation and their resilience. The discovery and rediscovery of hidden voices, those of the courtesans who fought to maintain their dignity and agency despite overwhelming societal constraints, has been one of the most significant contributions of modern scholarship. These reinterpretations have shown that the courtesans were not simply victims of a patriarchal system, but also women who exercised a degree of agency within the constraints of their roles. Through fiction, historical accounts, and art, we see how courtesans navigated the difficulties of their positions, and how their stories offer a new narrative about feminine resilience in a world that sought to control their bodies and their futures. In modern times, the Yoshiwara courtesans have found their way into contemporary art and literature. Far from being simply passive figures of sexual desire, they have become symbols of strength, survival, and subversion. Artists, filmmakers, and writers have used the legacy of these women to explore themes of femininity, sexual autonomy, and the exploitation of women throughout history. One of the most significant ways that the courtesan stories have been told in the modern era is through literature. Contemporary authors have used the figure of the courtesan to comment on the ways in which women's bodies are commodified and controlled by society. These works often blend the historical realities of the Yoshiwara with modern sensibilities, shedding light on the socio-political implications of the courtesans' lives. In visual arts, courtesans are often depicted as figures who are both beautiful and tragic. The ukiyo-e woodblock prints of the Edo period have been revitalized in the form of modern exhibitions, showing how the courtesan's image has evolved from a symbol of sexual desire to a complex figure of cultural reflection. These portrayals allow the courtesan to be viewed as more than just an object of male fantasy, they reveal the agency, intellect, and artistry of these women. In the ongoing discussion about the role of women in Japanese history, the courtesans remain important symbols of the complex relationship between beauty, sexuality, and morality in Japanese culture. Their beauty was both celebrated and commodified, but it also led to their exploitation. The courtesans' bodies were not just physical vessels for sexual pleasure but also representations of Japanese cultural ideals, beauty, grace, and sexual availability. Yet, the romanticized image of the courtesan as a symbol of sexual purity and artistic sophistication does not do justice to the social and economic pressures they endured. Modern perspectives on their lives help to highlight the contrast between the public glorification of their beauty and the personal cost of living in a system that demanded sexual servitude while disregarding their humanity. The courtesan stories are not simply historical relics, they are living, breathing symbols of the ongoing struggle for sexual autonomy and gender equality in Japan. In a society where women's bodies have long been commodified and controlled, the courtesans' lives offer a vivid reflection of the tensions between society's expectations and women's desires. One of the most poignant and significant aspects of the courtesans' lives was their struggle with pregnancy. Pregnancy represented a challenge to the brothel system because it threatened to disrupt the economic machinery of the Yoshiwara. For courtesans, pregnancy was more than just a biological event, it was an existential threat that could end their careers and diminish their value in society. Modern feminist scholars have used the courtesans' experiences with pregnancy to delve into issues of reproductive rights and autonomy. The decision to terminate a pregnancy or to raise a child was often dictated by the economic reality of the courtesan's life. These women had little control over their bodies, and their choices were constrained by a system that demanded their sexual availability above all else. Through the lens of feminist theory, we can see the parallels between the courtesan struggles and the broader global fight for women's reproductive rights. The control of women's bodies, whether through abortion, contraception, or social pressures, has long been a central issue in the gender equality movement. The courtesan's experiences, while rooted in the historical context of Edo Japan, resonate with modern discussions about reproductive freedom and gender autonomy. The legacy of the Yoshiwara courtesans has evolved in modern Japan, and they are no longer simply viewed as symbols of sexual desire but as complex, multidimensional figures whose lives reflect the social inequalities and gendered struggles of their time. Their struggles with pregnancy, their resilience in the face of exploitation, and their attempts to assert their personal agency within an oppressive system have led to their reclamation as symbols of empowerment and cultural memory. Today, the courtesans' stories are part of Japan's historical narrative, and their legacy is being rewritten not just as symbols of beauty and grace, but as women who defied the system in small but meaningful ways. The courtesans have come to symbolize the resilience of women, the struggle for autonomy, and the fight against societal control, a struggle that continues to be relevant in modern times. As we continue to delve into the world of Yoshiwara courtesans, we reach a moment of cultural and historical reclamation. These women, once considered little more than objects of desire and entertainment, are now being reinterpreted in modern culture as figures of resilience, strength, and agency. Their lives, marked by exploitation, control, and sacrifice, are being reconsidered through the lens of feminism, gender studies, and historical inquiry. The legacy of the courtesans is far more than just the reflection of an ancient social system. It is a conversation about autonomy, reproductive rights, and the fight for gender equality that continues to resonate today. In this segment, we will explore how the stories of the Yoshiwara courtesans are being reclaimed, not just as tragic victims of a patriarchal system, but as complex individuals whose experiences reveal the enduring struggle for women's autonomy in a deeply gendered society. The Yoshiwara district, which once stood as the pinnacle of pleasure and sexual commerce in Edo Japan, now represents something quite different. No longer merely a historical curiosity, the courtesans of the district have become the focus of a cultural rediscovery. In the context of modern Japan, where the Meiji era's reforms pushed the brothel system into obscurity, the women who once dominated the district are now being revisited in scholarship, art, and literature. Modern cultural movements, particularly feminism and gender equality movements, have created a renewed interest in the stories of these women, once lost to the margins of history. Rather than merely being objects of desire, courtesans are now seen as figures who exercised agency within an oppressive and exploitative system. The power of reclaiming their stories lies in the recognition of the complexity of their lives, not just as sexual beings, but as individuals who navigated and survived the harshest conditions imaginable. One of the primary means of this reclamation has been through the use of modern art. Filmmakers, visual artists, and writers have brought the Yoshiwara courtesans into the contemporary consciousness. In doing so, they have reshaped the narrative around these women, shifting the focus from mere sexual exploitation to an understanding of the brothel system as a larger social and economic construct that shaped women's lives in profound and enduring ways. In modern feminist discourse, the courtesans of the Yoshiwara are increasingly being viewed as symbols of resistance to patriarchal systems that seek to control and exploit women's bodies. Feminists today often refer to the courtesans as examples of women who, despite being caught in an oppressive system, still found ways to resist and maintain their dignity. They became symbols of autonomy in a world that sought to strip them of it. The central issue that feminist scholars have explored in the context of the Yoshiwara is the commodification of women's bodies. A theme that remains highly relevant in contemporary society. Just as women today still face battles over body autonomy, sexuality, and reproductive rights, the courtesans of the Yoshiwara faced similar struggles in their own time. They were forced to navigate a world where their sexuality and beauty were sold for profit, and where their reproductive choices were often dictated by the needs of their brothel owners. One of the most poignant aspects of the Yoshiwara courtesans' experience was their relationship with pregnancy, a subject that remains deeply relevant in discussions of reproductive rights today. For the courtesans, pregnancy was not just a personal event, it was an economic crisis that could signal the end of their career. Their bodies, once revered for their sexual allure, were now seen as a liability that needed to be controlled. Feminist scholars often point to the courtesans' experiences as a reflection of the ongoing struggles for reproductive autonomy that women face worldwide. The brothel system of Edo Japan was one in which a woman's fertility was not her own, it was managed by those who controlled her, from the brothel owners to the patrons who came to see her. Pregnancy, therefore, became a disruption in a system that demanded unfaltering sexual availability. In today's feminist discussions about reproductive rights, the courtesan struggles with fertility control, often through abortion, herbal remedies, and acupuncture, are seen as early examples of the limits and dangers of state-imposed reproductive control. The story of how these women navigated their bodies within a patriarchal system that sought to control their sexuality offers powerful insights into the history of reproductive justice. As the modern reinterpretation of the courtesans unfolds, one of the most striking aspects is the way in which their stories are told in art, literature, and cinema. No longer just idealized symbols of beauty, courtesans are now depicted as multidimensional figures, women who fought for survival in a world that placed immense pressure on them to remain sexually available, beautiful, and uncomplicated. In contemporary literature, courtesans have become central characters in stories about empowerment, agency, and resistance. Authors today portray them as women who challenged societal norms and exerted control over their lives, despite being trapped within a system designed to strip them of their autonomy. These modern stories often blend historical fact with fictionalized elements, creating a complex portrait of courtesans as both victims and survivors of a deeply unjust social system. In visual art, the Yoshiwara courtesans are increasingly depicted not as mere sexual objects, but as symbols of strength and resilience. Contemporary artists have taken the traditional ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and used them to highlight the contradictions of the courtesans' lives. The delicate beauty juxtaposed with the harsh reality of their lived experiences. These artworks serve as a reminder that while the beauty of the courtesans was celebrated, their humanity was often ignored or erased by the system they lived under. As the courtesans' stories have been reinterpreted in modern art and literature, they have also begun to serve as powerful symbols of contemporary struggles. The commodification of women's bodies, a theme that runs throughout the courtesans' experiences, is still relevant today. Women around the world continue to fight for control over their sexuality, reproductive rights, and personal autonomy. The Yoshiwara courtesans now stand as testaments to the ways in which society seeks to define and control women through their bodies. The courtesan struggles with pregnancy and fertility control in a time when women had few rights over their own bodies can be seen as an early example of reproductive injustice. Today, their stories speak to the ongoing battle for reproductive rights, as women everywhere continue to fight for access to safe and legal abortions, contraceptives, and the right to choose. The legacy of the courtesans has shifted significantly in modern Japan. Once a symbol of decay and disrepute, the courtesans of Edo Japan are now being celebrated for their strength, resilience, and cultural significance. Their stories, long buried in the shadows of history, are now part of the national consciousness, as Japan comes to terms with the complexity of its past and the gender dynamics that have shaped its development. Courtesans who once faced cultural shame are now being reclaimed as figures of empowerment, symbols of how women resist and survive within systems designed to exploit them. Through art, literature, and modern reinterpretations, the Yoshiwara courtesans have transitioned from being forgotten, marginalized women to being celebrated as icons of resilience and personal strength. As we step further into the 21st century, the story of the Yoshiwara courtesans, once confined to the shadows of Edo Japan's history, has undergone a profound transformation. No longer the forgotten victims of a merciless system, they have been reclaimed as symbols of strength, resilience, and complexity. Through art, literature, and the increasing feminist discourse surrounding their lives, the courtesan stories are being told not just as tales of exploitation, but as those of women who were both victims and survivors within a patriarchal structure. Their legacies are now influencing gender politics, reproductive rights, and the way we think about women's autonomy. Today, the Yoshiwara courtesans are being viewed through a new lens, one that recognizes their humanity and the powerful choices they made, even in the face of overwhelming societal and economic constraints. The courtesan stories are more than a reflection of a bygone era, they are living, breathing examples of how women have always fought for agency, even when society sought to control their bodies and limit their freedom. A central aspect of the courtesan stories, and one that resonates deeply in modern times, is the theme of reproductive autonomy. The brothel system in Edo, Japan was a world where women's bodies were controlled, not just by the brothel owners but by the very society that commodified them. In this system, pregnancy was seen as a disruption, a threat to the sexual availability of the courtesan, and an obstacle to the economic goals of the brothel system. For many courtesans, pregnancy meant forced abortions or exile from their careers. This struggle for control over their bodies echoes the modern debate surrounding reproductive rights. In today's world, women's reproductive autonomy continues to be a critical issue, one that directly impacts gender equality and personal freedom. As we examine the lives of these women in Edo, Japan, we see how their experiences with pregnancy, fertility control, and forced reproductive choices are reflective of the challenges women face today in securing their reproductive rights. The brothel system of Edo, Japan, in its focus on economic gain and sex work, mirrored the ways in which women's bodies were treated as property, especially when it came to reproduction. Whether it was abortion, contraception, or fertility regulation, the women of the Yoshiwara had limited control over their own bodies. Modern discussions about reproductive rights, particularly in relation to safe abortions and birth control, trace their roots back to this historical struggle. Just as women today continue to fight for reproductive autonomy, the courtesans of Edo, Japan were also, in their own way, resisting the forces that sought to control their fertility. In the world of contemporary feminism, the Yoshiwara courtesans have become powerful symbols of the ways in which patriarchy and capitalism intersect to exploit and control women's bodies. Feminist scholars today view these courtesans as both victims of a sexist society and as agents of resistance. Despite the exploitation they faced, many courtesans managed to assert their autonomy in small ways. Whether through resisting pregnancy, exercising sexual agency, or even writing and engaging in art, these women found ways to navigate a world that sought to erase their humanity and personhood. Feminist discourse has increasingly pointed to the way that the Yoshiwara courtesans embodied the tensions between sexual agency and exploitation. Their sexuality was commodified, yet they used their bodies and sexual appeal to navigate power dynamics. They did not exist solely as victims, they found ways to resist within the confines of their oppressive situation. Today, the courtesans of Edo, Japan serve as a mirror to contemporary discussions of sexual autonomy, agency, and women's rights. The dilemmas they faced around pregnancy, sexuality, and personal choices are reflected in the modern struggles for women's rights to make decisions about their bodies without interference from society or government. The reproductive justice movement today has deep roots in the struggles that courtesans faced in Edo, Japan. The movement, which seeks to ensure that women of all backgrounds, especially those marginalized by race, class, and status, have access to safe, affordable reproductive health care, draws heavily from the historical struggles for reproductive autonomy. In this context, the stories of the Yoshiwara courtesans are powerful reminders of how far society has come, and how far it still needs to go, in the fight for reproductive justice. While the Meiji-era reforms and the eventual abolition of brothel systems in Japan removed the formalized exploitation of women's bodies, the fight for reproductive rights and autonomy continues. The courtesans' experiences are a testament to the ways in which women's reproductive choices have long been controlled by both societal norms and economic forces. Their struggles remind us that the fight for sexual freedom and reproductive rights is not a new battle, but one that has been fought for centuries. The image of the courtesan has long been a subject of artistic fascination. During the Edo period, courtesans were often depicted in ukiyo-e woodblock prints, which celebrated their beauty, grace, and sexual allure. However, these depictions often glorified their roles as sexual objects without acknowledging the harsh realities they faced. In contemporary times, these images are being reinterpreted by artists and historians, who aim to correct the romanticized narrative and bring forth the true stories of these women. Modern artistic and literary reinterpretations of the courtesan's image are powerful tools for social change. Artists and writers have taken these iconic figures and reimagined them as symbols of resistance, autonomy, and resilience. These modern representations challenge the commodification of women's bodies and highlight the ways in which sexuality and sexual autonomy are still being regulated today. By turning these traditional images on their head, contemporary artists and scholars are offering a new perspective on the courtesans' lives, one that emphasizes their humanity, agency, and resilience, rather than their role as sexual objects. As the Yoshiwara courtesan stories are reclaimed and reinterpreted, their influence extends into the ongoing conversation surrounding gender equality, sexual autonomy, and the commodification of women's bodies. Today, the courtesans are no longer merely seen as tragic victims of a patriarchal system, but as complex figures who, despite being trapped in an oppressive system, fought for control over their bodies and lives. The brothel system that controlled the courtesans' lives parallels the modern struggles women face in societies that seek to control their bodies through social, legal, and economic systems. Whether it's the struggle for abortion access, birth control, or the right to choose, the legacy of the courtesans serves as a powerful metaphor for the ongoing fight for gender equality and autonomy in the 21st century. As we continue to unravel the lives of the Yoshiwara courtesans, we uncover not only the complexity of their personal struggles but also the cultural impact that their stories have had over centuries. These women, often silenced by the very systems that sought to control them, now stand as symbols of resistance, resilience, and autonomy. The Yoshiwara courtesans were more than mere victims of an oppressive patriarchal system. They were, in their own ways, survivors who navigated a world that reduced them to commodities, yet found ways to assert their humanity and agency. The exploration of their legacy in modern times has illuminated the continuing struggles that women face regarding their bodies, sexuality, and reproductive rights. Today, the courtesan stories have become part of the larger cultural conversation about gender equity, sexual freedom, and women's autonomy. Their fight for control over their bodies has, in many ways, become a blueprint for the ongoing struggles for women's rights in the modern world. The courtesans of the Yoshiwara district have increasingly become symbols of feminist resistance in the modern age. Their stories of survival, despite the economic exploitation and cultural oppression they faced, are being celebrated as examples of women's resilience and strength. Today, we can examine their lives not as simple tales of victimization but as profound accounts of agency, women who, despite being trapped in a system of patriarchal control, found ways to assert their humanity and navigate power structures that sought to strip them of their dignity. Feminist scholars have begun to reinterpret the courtesans' roles, highlighting their ability to resist the dominant male gaze, even when their lives were controlled by the brothel owners, patrons, and social expectations. These courtesan stories reflect how women throughout history have had to navigate systems of exploitation and still find ways to maintain personal dignity and personal agency. They exemplify the resilience required to survive within oppressive structures while also shedding light on the complexity of being both victims and survivors in a society that commodifies their sexuality. A crucial part of the courtesans' lives was their relationship to pregnancy, a theme that resonates deeply in today's reproductive justice discourse. During the Edo period, pregnancy in the Yoshiwara was seen as a threat, a disruption to the brothel's economic structure. Courtesans who became pregnant often faced forced abortions, exile, or abandonment by their patrons and brothel owners. Their fertility, once seen as an asset, became a liability when it was perceived as impeding their ability to work. This reproductive struggle faced by courtesans is not simply a historical issue but is part of ongoing battles for women's reproductive rights today. Just as Edo courtesans had to make life-altering decisions about pregnancy and abortion within a system that controlled their bodies, women today continue to fight for safe abortion access, birth control rights, and the freedom to make choices about their own reproductive futures. In examining the lives of the courtesans, we see how reproductive autonomy has long been a central issue in women's rights struggles. The courtesans' decisions about pregnancy, whether to terminate or carry to term, were not simply personal decisions but were deeply intertwined with their economic survival and social survival within the brothel system. This is a reality many women still face today, where their choices about reproduction are often dictated by economic and societal pressures. The lives of the Yoshiwara courtesans have also been reimagined through modern art and literature, providing a platform for new interpretations of their stories. These reinterpreted images no longer focus solely on the courtesans as sex objects but explore their humanity and the power dynamics that governed their lives. Through contemporary visual art, fiction, and historical narratives, the the Yoshiwara courtesans are being reclaimed as symbols of agency and empowerment. In modern literature, courtesans are often depicted as strong, multidimensional women who faced adversity and yet still managed to assert their independence within an exploitative system. These representations break away from the traditional narratives of victimhood and focus on the agency courtesans had, even if their autonomy was limited by their social status and economic necessity. Writers today are not simply writing about their beauty and grace. They are writing about their inner lives, their struggles for personal freedom, and their unrecognized power. In visual arts, the depiction of courtesans has evolved from idealized representations to more complex portrayals. Where once the ukiyo-e prints showed only their beauty and sexuality, modern reinterpretations often highlight the struggles these women faced. Courtesans are now shown as powerful figures, challenging patriarchal structures, and using their sexual appeal to survive and resist the forces that sought to control them. These modern works, from graphic novels to art exhibitions, have become powerful tools for discussing gender inequality and the commodification of women's bodies. The courtesans of Edo Japan also serve as symbols for the modern gender equality movement, which continues to address the issues of sexual autonomy, reproductive rights, and the commodification of women's bodies. Their lives and struggles offer profound insights into the ways women throughout history have fought against patriarchy and gender-based oppression. In contemporary Japan, the legacy of the courtesans is intertwined with modern feminist movements that are fighting for equal rights, sexual freedom, and bodily autonomy. Just as courtesans were reduced to commodities for sexual pleasure, women today still face the commodification of their sexuality in both the media and society. The Yoshiwara courtesans, therefore, provide a historical parallel to the gendered exploitation that still affects women globally. Their stories, of resilience, choice, and struggle, serve as inspiration for women today who are challenging the same systems of exploitation. The reclaiming of courtesan narratives is part of the larger movement for women's empowerment, where women are asserting their sexual autonomy and humanity in the face of systems that seek to limit their agency. Some historians and feminists have even begun to call the Yoshiwara courtesans the first feminists. While this term may seem controversial to some, it reflects the growing understanding of how these women navigated a world that sought to reduce them to sexual objects. The courtesans were among the first to assert control over their bodies, making difficult choices about pregnancy, sexuality, and freedom in a system that provided them with few options. By rejecting the notion that their bodies were for sale and asserting their autonomy, the courtesans acted as early resistors to the systems that sought to exploit women. Whether through self-empowerment, subtle defiance, or even resistance to forced pregnancy and abortion, the courtesans demonstrated an early form of feminist resistance, one that was quiet, hidden, and often invisible, but no less significant. As we look back on the Yoshiwara courtesans, we begin to see them in a new light, not just as victims of a cruel and exploitative system but as complex figures who navigated their roles with agency, resilience, and strength. The legacy of these women continues to resonate today in the ongoing struggles for gender equality, sexual autonomy, and reproductive justice. The courtesan stories remind us that the fight for women's rights has a long history, one that continues to shape the ways in which women today assert their autonomy over their bodies, their choices, and their futures. Through modern art, literature, and feminist discourse, the courtesans are reclaimed as symbols of strength and empowerment, reminding us of the complex and resilient nature of all women throughout history. As we journey through the lives of the Yoshiwara courtesans, we have explored their struggles with reproductive autonomy, their role in the brothel system, and how their stories have been forgotten, misrepresented, and now, reclaimed. In this segment, we turn our attention to the political and social implications of their lives, as well as their lasting influence on modern discussions of gender equality, sexual autonomy, and reproductive justice. Their stories resonate with us today, not merely as relics of an ancient past, but as living, breathing examples of how women's struggles for autonomy and control over their bodies have been central to the feminist movement throughout history. The Yoshiwara courtesans, as symbols of sexual commodification, also serve as important reminders of how patriarchy and capitalism intersect to exploit women's bodies for economic gain, while simultaneously denying them the right to decide their own futures. In this segment, we will continue to unravel the profound legacies of these women, examining how their struggles and resistance reverberate throughout modern culture, and how their stories have been reclaimed and reinterpreted to fit within the larger framework of gender rights in the 21st century. One of the central themes that tie the courtesan's struggles to modern issues is the idea of reproductive control. In Edo Japan, the bodies of courtesans were treated as commodities to be controlled and regulated for the pleasure and profit of men. Pregnancy, for these women, was an inconvenience, a disruption to the economic system that relied on their sexual availability. Women who became pregnant were often forced into abortions, either through dangerous herbal remedies, acupuncture, or manual procedures, all performed without proper medical supervision. The lack of choice and control over their bodies mirrors the ongoing battle for reproductive rights faced by women today. In modern times, women across the globe still struggle to secure control over their own bodies, particularly when it comes to reproductive choices. The right to choose an abortion, access contraceptives, and make decisions about fertility continues to be at the forefront of gender justice movements. The legacy of the courtesans serves as a stark reminder that the fight for reproductive autonomy is not new, it is a struggle that has spanned centuries, from the courtesans of Edo Japan to women today, fighting for the right to determine their own futures. The control of women's bodies, whether through social expectations or legal restrictions, remains a persistent issue, with historical precedents found in the lives of the Yoshiwara courtesans. Today, as we fight for reproductive justice, the story of the courtesans echoes in the call for bodily autonomy, a theme that transcends time and remains crucial to the ongoing fight for gender equality. As we turn our focus to the feminist implications of the courtesan stories, it becomes clear that these women, despite being subject to immense exploitation, exerted resistance in their own subtle ways. While the brothel system sought to reduce them to sexual objects, the Yoshiwara courtesans found ways to assert control over their bodies, choices, and lives within the constraints of their roles. Their resistance was not always overt, but it was nonetheless powerful. Courtesans who managed to navigate the system without losing their dignity, whether by maintaining agency in sexual encounters, rebelling against certain expectations, or asserting personal autonomy within the limited space they had, embody the essence of feminist resistance. Feminist scholars have increasingly looked to these courtesans as early figures of gender resistance. Their ability to challenge patriarchal systems, even within a system as rigid and controlling as the Yoshiwara brothel, is a powerful testament to the ways in which women have always resisted the systems that sought to oppress them. Their stories serve as an important reminder that feminist resistance can take many forms, and often, it is not about grand gestures, but the small, everyday acts of resilience, choice, and assertion that define a woman's autonomy. The modern interpretation of the Yoshiwara courtesans in media has been transformative. Whereas traditional ukiyo-e woodblock prints often idealize these women as beautiful, graceful, and elegant, contemporary portrayals are far more nuanced. Modern art, literature, and cinema have begun to paint a more complicated picture of the courtesans, showing them not just as sexual objects, but as multidimensional characters navigating a world of oppression, struggle, and resilience. In contemporary art, courtesans are often reimagined as figures of resistance, symbols of autonomy, and survival. Artists today are increasingly using the image of the courtesan to comment on social issues such as capitalism, sexuality, and gendered exploitation. The portrayal of courtesans as symbols of sexual liberation or empowerment has become increasingly common, as their stories are understood in a broader cultural context that challenges the traditional roles they were forced to play in Edo society. Through graphic novels, films, and theater, the courtesan is no longer just a tragic figure, she is a symbol of agency, and her sexuality is often reinterpreted as a form of resistance against a system that sought to exploit and control her. These modern reimaginings of the courtesans allow for a more holistic view of their lives, showing their struggles as part of a larger movement for women's autonomy and reproductive justice. The legacy of the Yoshiwara courtesans extends beyond the historical period in which they lived. Their stories have become symbols in the larger fight for women's rights. The commodification of women's bodies, the struggle for reproductive autonomy, and the fight for sexual freedom that these women faced are still relevant today. As society continues to grapple with issues of gender inequality and reproductive justice, the Yoshiwara courtesans serve as a powerful reminder of the ways in which women's autonomy has always been under threat. Whether through the control of women's bodies in the past or the restrictive laws and social stigmas that women face today, the fight for sexual autonomy is ongoing. The courtesan's legacy serves as a cultural touchstone, one that highlights how women have consistently resisted the forces that seek to commodify and control them. From Edo Japan to the 21st century, women have fought for control over their bodies, choice in reproduction, and the right to define their own futures. The Yoshiwara courtesans were among the first to rebel against systems that exploited them, and their struggles have helped pave the way for the reproductive rights movements of today. The pop culture representation of the Yoshiwara courtesans continues to evolve, and today, their influence is seen in everything from cinema to literature to visual art. Films such as Memoirs of a Geisha have popularized the image of the courtesan, though often with some historical romanticism. Yet even in these portrayals, the courtesans are shown as complex, tragic, and empowered figures, symbols of the tension between sexual exploitation and personal strength. In modern literature, courtesans are often depicted as tragic heroines, struggling to maintain their dignity and humanity in a world that reduces them to mere objects of desire. However, these characters often show incredible resilience, and their stories are frequently retold as empowerment narratives, where the courtesans assert control over their bodies and choices, even when society and the system of exploitation attempt to deny them that right. The Yoshiwara courtesans continue to influence the way we think about women's autonomy, sexual freedom, and gender justice. Their struggles for reproductive control, sexual autonomy, and human dignity serve as an inspiration for the feminist movements of today. From sexual exploitation to the fight for reproductive rights, the courtesan stories have become symbols of the ongoing battle for women's rights. Through art, literature, and feminist discourse, the courtesans are being reclaimed not just as symbols of sexual desire but as powerful figures of resistance, whose lives serve as a testament to women's strength, resilience, and the enduring struggle for autonomy. Their legacy, built on the fight for control over their bodies, continues to reverberate in the modern world, reminding us of the importance of reproductive justice, gender equality, and sexual liberation. As we close the chapter on the lives and legacies of the Yoshiwara courtesans, we reflect on the lasting impact these women have had on gender discourse, sexual autonomy, and the ongoing fight for reproductive rights. From their struggles with pregnancy and reproductive control to their ability to navigate a system of exploitation, the courtesan stories are an essential part of the broader history of women's empowerment. Today, we look back on their lives, no longer just as tragic victims of a patriarchal system, but as resilient survivors and symbols of resistance. Their humanity, strength, and agency have been reclaimed in modern times, reminding us of the power women have to resist, fight, and create change, even in the most oppressive systems. The stories of these courtesans echo in today's reproductive justice movements, feminist discourse, and art, where the legacy of these women has been woven into the fabric of the ongoing fight for gender equality, sexual freedom, and bodily autonomy. The courtesans' experiences remind us that the fight for women's rights is not just a modern battle, it is a centuries-old struggle, one that continues to shape the world we live in today. Before we end tonight's journey, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What aspects of the courtesan's stories resonated with you the most? Was there a particular moment or struggle that stood out to you as especially significant in today's world? I would love to read your reflections in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? I always enjoy seeing the diverse places people tune in from. What time is it where you are? I find it fascinating to learn about the different time zones and cultures connected by this shared love of history. Drop your answers in the comments below, and I'll take a moment to look at your locations and read your thoughts. And, if you found this video insightful, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of history, where we uncover the truth behind the shadows and bring forgotten voices back to life. Your support helps keep these important stories alive. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through history, where we've explored the profound legacy of the Yoshiwara courtesans. From the streets of Edo, Japan to the modern world, their stories continue to inspire and challenge us to rethink issues of reproductive justice, sexual autonomy, and gender equality. Until next time, may you sleep well, knowing that the voices of these women have been heard and their stories will continue to inspire future generations.